Hello, I'm Josephine Burton and welcome back to the Dash Arts podcast, seeing the world through an artistic lens. Over the course of making this series on silence, I thought a great deal about different types of silence, both the experience of being silenced and choosing to be silent. In this episode on censorship, we bring it right up to the present day, from one of the most influential writers of the 20th century who chose to edit and self-censor his own writings, to being silent as a form of protest, and to those who've been silenced by their opinions on Brexit or by COVID. To start the episode, I talked to Mayssa Issa, a French-Algerian music journalist who I met a few years ago in Paris when she was covering music across the Arabic world. I picked up the phone to speak with her about the ways in which non-white French artists continue to be silenced. We ended up talking about the music scene more widely.
I have been working for years with artists from all over the world, but specifically also from Europe and from the other side of the Mediterranean, from the MENA region. And I think that we can distinguish two sorts or maybe three sorts of silences. I have noticed that a lot of people, artists specifically, did not choose to silence themselves. They were silenced by what they were living, politically speaking and socially speaking. If we do not speak about artists from the coming from origins from the MENA region, if we speak world music wise and any artist expressing himself, I think the word silence is more, I would say, is more vicious. Yes, because it's not only linked to a social or to a political situation. I think it's linked to a muting society, and a muting society that is based on a democratic basis, at least apparently. And a lot of artists are discovering today that their democracy and their liberty and their expression is not as free as they thought. They thought that they could say everything, and basically they can't. Not all the time, not today.
Are you thinking specifically about some particular artists in France that you're aware of that are choosing to stay silent?
I think of the situation today as very relevant and very important and reflecting what is the role of art in our societies in general, but also in Europe and particularly in France. I think that France is living like the whole world, a very, very hard crisis in the cultural field and especially in music. And I noticed that a lot of artists have been, silenced by what's happening. I think of people like Ashka, for instance, who's a normal, let's say, entre parenthèses, French artist from Arabic origin. But with what's going on, he decided to make a song called We Can Still Sing and We Can Still Dance, On peut encore danser et chanter. And he went around the public places, occupying the public place to sing it. And I think that it's not his Arabic origin that made him react in that way. It's more about what's going on in France. The silence is not only for a particular form of artists. Everybody is obliged to reinvent a way to express and reinvent resistance as well, because I think there's something of that going on today in France. Artists have been communicating on internet about it, and there was Camille, who was a French artist and who hasn't done any shows, but lately have created also a series on internet of sort of a calling to keep on the fight. This is how I think the articulation between silence and political situation in France is taking place. It's not comparable to what's going on from the other side of the Mediterranean.
Is it to do with the Gilets jaunes? Is that played into all of the continual curfews that are happening on the streets in France? Is it inability to access the public space?
I think there's a very clear link between what started in France with the Gilets jaunes, but then was stopped by what the international crisis of the COVID and the sanitary crisis, But something started at that point in France, socially. But what happened during the COVID and during the crisis is that artists were stopped from music, where a lot of them find the decisions of the government unfair. And that linked them to the social movement, not in a direct way to Gilets jaunes, because the Gilets jaunes anyway is not a very mediatized movement. It's more like an underground resistance for the meanwhile in France. But I think it linked them to a certain idea of what would be the society they would live in tomorrow if they kept on doing their music and not reacting to these restrictions and not reacting to this what has been called in France unessential field. Culture has been called as an unessential field, meaning that music and theater and operas and everything that has to do with music and culture is unessential, so that the venues are closed and other places were open. So it created a feeling of injustice, and that prevailed on from what origin you are, and are you from North African, whether you are French living in the 5e arrondissement. There's something common now, saying that do we have the right or not to express ourselves, and can we keep on going out and doing our concerts in the public place? And in that extent, I think there's a mixture of resistance in the French society that is taking place. It will be probably expressed by music, like Ashka did while he was, occupying Théâtre de l'Odéon, or going to Perpignan, going to all these cultural places and just singing. The last one was in Gare du Nord. You can see it on internet. It's called Ashka, on peut continuer à chanter. We can still sing. And they just went into the station of Gare du Nord train station and started an improvised concert, and then disappeared. And I think it's about silencing, because it's not only COVID, and it's something about, a society that's muting. That's why I'm saying muting again. There are some illogical things that have been done, and artists have been, saying that in different ways on the social media, and been wondering why they are not allowed to express themselves.
The way Mayssa discussed the situation for artists in France felt very familiar. In the UK, many of our artists have felt silenced through restrictions put in place through COVID or recent new policing regulations, and also Brexit. And they've taken to social media to voice their opinions about it. Manick Govinda is a freelance arts consultant who has spoken openly about his pro-Brexit stance and how that's affected his own work.
Manick, it's really lovely to speak to you. We haven't really had a chance to speak, and I just thought this would be a wonderful forum in which we could talk about, I suppose, censorship and self-censorship, particularly in connection to what has happened in the arts, particularly over the last few years around Brexit.
Well, if the question is how difficult was it, or how easy was it to express an opinion within a cultural context around leaving the EU, I think it was very hard, because the majority of people that work in the arts and cultural sector believe in freedom of movement, believe in freedom of ideas, and the free-flowing relationship that one has with art and culture and the products and goods and people. So when Brexit, I suppose, kind of called that into question, people were highly alarmed, but I think the response was probably more of an emotional one rather than a rational one, and that started to blinker the arts institution. So it was very hard, particularly when you're employed by organisations that receive EU funding, get EU support.
Were you silent, or were you silenced? That line is going around in my head a lot, and I've been thinking about it in the context of decisions around self-censorship and censorship. And did you think about those issues? Did you feel that you were silenced, or did you consider being silent?
Yeah, good question. I think my experience, particularly in the early days, just before the referendum and then the referendum, there's a kind of indirect coercion that happens where obviously most of the arts institutions will say that they believe in freedom of expression, as long as it's not slandering individuals or saying bad things about the organisation you work for, or the institutions that you're associated with. You should be free to express your opinion, but that was called into question hugely because the blur between how much of your own individual autonomy you have and how much of your subject, of me as a subject, is owned by organisations, whether that might be a corporate or whether that might be a charity or whether that's a cultural institution. One's treading this fine line all the time of what is your individual voice, and that's where the conflict happens. So I was feeling that I was treading that fine line between, do I just keep quiet, just quietly tick that leave box and not tell anyone, or do I express why? I decided to choose the latter, which it caused a lot of conflict. It did cause a lot of arguments. It was difficult, certainly when you're on the payroll of an organisation. So I think now, being a freelance and independent arts consultant, I have a lot more autonomy compared to 2-3 years ago. So I think, yes, I've felt that sometimes I was forced to be silent, and perhaps there were coercive measures to silence me, when people are investigating your social media site and legal advice is being sought by trustees or by directors, then that they are trying to perhaps use the legal sanctions to silence me, and I found that quite troubling.
Yeah, no, I can understand why you do and did. I was just thinking about people trawling through your social media. I do think social media has amplified this debate in a way, hasn't it? And it's completely changed it so that people are more public in their opinions than they ever had before, which can lead to issues around censorship or decisions around self-censorship. Perhaps it brings those arguments to the fore in a way that we never really talked about it or needed to acknowledge them before.
Yeah, social media has changed everything. It has given voice to people. It's a platform that allows us to say what we think, whether that is civil or vulgar or offensive. We're constantly having to look at what the road is. Sometimes it can be unpleasant, and I certainly know that. I think what social media has done is really help individuals give voice, and obviously we've seen that as a progressive force for good when there's atrocities in human rights, and so many online petitions. I've signed 2 today against the policing bill, for example. It is a force for good, but also contradictory. It's also a force that can be quite negative. So we mustn't lose sight that the Arab Spring and other uprisings, Black Lives Matter, the current women's rights and women's safety. Social media platforms are vehicles to get these messages across, to have that debate and to have those important conversations. They are public spaces now. In the context of lockdown, they are even more so public spaces, because we're free assembly, and meeting other people is now almost a criminal offence.
I'm interested, having gone through this experience, that you reflecting back that there was this decision that you could have chosen, you could have taken to be silent, and you chose to assert your freedom of expression. Are there places where kind of civic responsibility compel us to remain silent on issues?
We should try and be civil as much as possible. There's also an argument, which I read by a very good Marxist American female writer, about the importance of vulgarity, and obviously vulgarity is seen as a much more working class, blue collar mode of speaking compared to the sort of civility of language in maybe more educated or middle classes. Vulgarity is also a weapon that can be used. It's obviously very messy, it's very unpleasant, but it has a voice, and it's a voice that shouldn't be silenced. I would much rather, for good or for bad, that people engage, and then if you engage, you have that argument. People might be angry at you, but you're able to put a counterpoint to that. So I think we should speak up. Remaining silent, sometimes tactically, you may have to do that if you're under threat, or if your livelihood's at risk. I think in the sort of old-fashioned idea of what liberty is that everyone has a voice and everyone has a right to express him or herself.
Having felt silence to some degree over the last few years, has that experience changed you, do you think, as an artist, as a civilian?
I think, certainly there's times when I know it's best not to comment and just be more reflective and thoughtful. So silence is important in that sense, to have that self-reflection, to think on things before one just spontaneously kind of retort against an issue or a point of view or an action. I'm probably a bit more discerning than I used to be on where, what my intervention is going to be on social media. A few years ago, I was maybe firing at all guns. Something I found troublesome, I would just say it. Social media doesn't also represent the majority of people in civil life and public life. So I'd much rather have conversations like this, for example. And I think it's very interesting in terms of artistic expression, because there should be work that just allows for complexity, ambiguity, that can be read in different ways. And my worry at the moment sometimes is that art can feel a bit too propagandist, that it has a position and therefore it's going to express that position to try and convince you to behave in certain ways. Or it's just articulating a very enclosed sense of the world, which loses that complexity. And it's really interesting to see writers talking, being much more concerned about cancel culture and how certain writers or journalists are being vilified on social media because they have a different point of view. So the more voices that we hear in the arts to say this witch hunt or this this call out culture is not very helpful. From Barack Obama to Salman Rushdie and Kazuo Ishiguro, it's very important because we still need complexity in art. We can't just be black and white about issues.
Whilst Manick and I might not agree about Brexit, I entirely agree with his assertion that art should be complex and messy. His suggestion that writers are now censoring themselves more led me to the playwright Samuel Beckett, who wrote such phenomenal plays as Endgame and Waiting for Godot. Beckett was a ruthless editor of his own work, and a writer who dealt with the most complex and harrowing subject matters. I spoke to Jackie Blackman, a Beckett scholar who wrote on Beckett and Ethics, to find out more.
Can we start from the beginning, and can you tell me the role that silence played in Beckett's writing? I would love your thoughts on that.
So I never saw it as silence, exactly. I saw it as a way of dealing with trauma, horror, censorship in a particular way. It was like an aesthetic that developed out of those conditions. He also, when he was writing Endgame, he met the painter Avigdor Arica. He was a Jewish painter who had been a survivor of a camp. And I think it was, it was quite interesting, his relationship with him and the kind of sense one gets from Endgame of the sort of suffering of people in the camps. And I think that's what Adorno was responding to. Adorno wrote, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric in 1949. And then in 1966, I think in response to reading Beckett's work, he wrote, "Perennial suffering has as much right to expression as a tortured man has to scream. Hence, it may have been wrong to say that after Auschwitz you could no longer write poems." So I think that's not quite as well known as his first quote.
You think that Adorno actually acknowledged that he'd seen Beckett's work and it had made him rethink it?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just quote you a bit from what he said.
Please do.
The most far-out dictum from Becketts Endgame, that there really is not so much to be feared anymore, reacts to a practice whose first sample was given in the concentration camps. What the sadists in the camps foretold their victims. "Tomorrow you'll be wriggling skyward as smoke from this chimney," bespeaks the indifference of each individual life that is the direction of history. And he obviously went on in the same piece to write what I said to you: "Perennial suffering has as much right to expression as a tortured man has to scream." So that was in response to Beckett's Endgame.
We chatted about the many pauses and beats in Beckett's work. Jackie believes that they underline or emphasise a form of self-censorship.
Do you think that Beckett was kind of consciously
self-censoring himself?
Yes, I would say so. You're brought up in an environment where people, need to be careful what they say, or there are consequences. So I think that's just like you're conditioned into self-censoring. In Waiting for Godot, I told you the character, Estragon, was named Levi. And Levi was the most common French Jewish name in France at the time, before the deportations. So it was like his character, Estragon, was Jew the everyman, It was like just a Jew, typical Jew. And he decided to take that out. Now, whether he decided to take that out because he thought, well, maybe his play would do better if he took it out, or for what reason, I can't actually tell you. Nobody can tell you. But the fact is he did take it out, and if he hadn't have taken it out, what would we all feel about Waiting for Godot now? Would it be the famous play that it is? I don't know.
That's fascinating.
It is really interesting. Like, it's properly interesting, this stuff. I think, producing, the perfect piece was what he was about. And yes, he was, thank goodness for us all, he managed to express the horror of the time through those perfect pieces and gave a lot of people freedom to speak, showed people how to speak. And be respectful at the same time.
That's an amazing line. And you think his writing enabled others to voice themselves?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. He was very courageous in putting out stuff that nobody would have put out anyway and thought they would have got anywhere. He was courageous in holding out for his particular aesthetic. He just, this was how he expressed himself, and it was a headline act.
And back to Manick on the role and place of silence in art.
I think having worked with so many live arts practitioners and performance artists, the idea of presence, physical presence, can say so much more sometimes in a particular context of work where there's nothing, the voice is not being used, but just the physicality of that artist in a particular space. And that can be very powerful. There's an American East Asian artist called Tishing Say who uses silence a lot, and he would do these year-long performances which are incredibly haunting. One performance where in the 80s where he just punched into a factory time clock every hour on that hour for a whole year, and just watch the passing of time doing that action. Art that says nothing, verbally, orally, can be so powerful when it's just a simple action. So non-verbal silence doesn't have to be not talking. When none of us are silenced in that sense, we're always marking time and space. I'm appreciating a lot of painting at the moment. It's non-verbal. It's an expression through physical materials, and a lot of younger artists I know are being much more subtle about their work, where it kind of verges on surrealism, where it verges on the absurdism of life, and work that is less political, work that has another form of freedom and expression. I'm finding that a lot more engaging these days.
It's interesting that you've gone there from when I asked you about, because having read about the policing bill last night and all this stuff around noise levels, which seems to be a really important part of the police bills. Like, a lot of people are very upset about the noise decimal levels that are being made around Parliament with Steve Bray and his megaphone, and it's all very disruptive. And I was going to share with you that we're hoping to try and speak to this Turkish protester called Erdem Gündüz, who did these silent protests. And I was going to say, maybe we're going to see a whole lot of these silent protests now happening around. Ironically, I was going to say the silence to me is extremely political.
Oh, completely. I think, at the moment it's been in many countries being forced to wear masks in this pandemic, that already has a symbolic image of being gagged, being silenced, being censored, and anti-censorship campaigns constantly uses that image of the gagged individual. But also, the noise and chaos and disruption are usually responses against state aggression. When the police or government starts to come down on people, then people do retaliate sometimes.
We did manage to speak to Erdem Gündüz. We tracked him down in Poland, where he'd been living for the past 3 years, to speak to us about his incredible silent protest in Turkey in 2013. I would love to hear a little bit more about your work as an artist and why you chose to use silence as part of your standing protest in the Gezi Park protests.
The Gezi Park protests start and the government use so much power and police brutality, and then they announced Gezi Park protest is over. After that day, I was there and stand still 8 hours in the middle of the Taksim Square.
Did you choose at that moment to stay? You decided after the authorities cleared the park, and you chose to stay by yourself and remain standing?
I didn't think that. My body decided. And everything was tried during the Gezi movement. People singing, doing yoga, doing many things. But the government was deaf. Or they don't want to see, they don't want to hear, they don't want to talk. They just blaming others, who was in the Gezi Park as a protester, provocateur, or terrorist, or marginal. It means that people try to tell their reason. They use many ways. And I think why my body choose the silence, because sometimes silence tell more than words. My aim is not going there and make silent protest. My aim is make protest.
And then did people come to join you, Erdem, to stand with you in silence?
Yeah, it needs 3 hours or 5 hours. I'm not sure, but end of the day, 300 people joined, and the protest finished around 2 o'clock in the morning, because I started around 6, and because police wants to take the who standing there.
And did people, when you were standing there in silence in the square, being joined by people, did the police come to ask you what you were doing, or was it very clear and symbolic that you were protesting in silence?
Yeah, they come maybe 1.5 hours later, and then they asked me some question, but I don't know. I didn't give answer, and they start to check my backpack, and they want to see what I have in my pocket, or this is something like actually rapping someone, because they didn't ask my permission, and it was not good days. Many people died. They didn't judge this charge that police, and I was really angry at that time. Maybe I couldn't find a word to tell, and then I keep my silence, maybe because they want, if I say something, they make some small change and then put me jail. I don't know, really. I didn't think why I didn't talk at that moment. I think it's maybe it's about myself, because I start theater, but my talk, my read, the text, it was not good. I'm not a verbal person. I act with my body. I dance with my body. I express my thoughts with my body. Maybe that's the reason I prefer to not talk, because my body express more than the
So
word.
that's really interesting to hear, Erdem. So it sounds like you were in this moment of crisis. You went as an artist. You went to the place which you were most secure, which was your physical presence, not your voice. What is amazing to me about what you did on that day, Erdem, is that you took the control of the situation. You know, you made the decision to be silent. It was not that, you know, you were silenced by the authorities. It was you took that power. Did it feel powerful at the time?
Actually, I understand how it was powerful after 2 days later, because I didn't know what's happened really. I just saw some TV and some people around me coming for supporting. I didn't thought that it gave people hope again. I have one small hope, and I maybe share with other people and the other people. I believe non-verbal things are more important than the verbs, and or verb, because non-verbal things was connect our life before 2 years old. Like love or miss or lost or fear or something unknown. That's the reason the silence connect with that source. That's the reason the silence is much more important than the verb or shouting or break down the window.
I found Erdem's use of silence as a force for protest amazingly inspiring. He truly believes that conscious, non-verbal action can have more impact than words. At the other end of the spectrum, Mayssa told me that the enforced silence on artists in France, imposed by the government, has been unifying and has also been a catalyst for change.
There's also manifest of certain artists that came together to say that they were not okay with not being able to continue to sing, continue to express themselves, etc. And a couple of manifests have been signed by many artists from different fields and different origins. And so, yeah, something is going on, definitely.
I don't think we are in the same place in the UK. There are many freelance artists who have not been able to receive money, but we are not organised in the same way. And I wondered, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about, you know, those times when I was in Paris, you know, in the 80s and the 90s, there was always protests, you know, people were always marching, there was always strikes. I think in France, you've always been better at organising yourselves than in the UK. That's my immediate impression.
Well, I think that there in France there is une culture de la manifestation. I think there's something in the French culture about manifesting, about saying what's not going on right and going on the road for it. And I think the COVID crisis put France in silence, on mute France in different sectors, not only in culture. There's still this form of injustice. It exists, and basically people who are really not in a good situation before COVID are even worse today. But there's also sort of And people are trying to artists are trying to invent solutions as well for them to stay alive, and live streamings and different ways of continuing the creation and the creativity they have. It's like when some artists that didn't really care about politics or were not very into social issues, after what's going on now, are starting some of them are starting to express themselves differently, but not all of them. Huh? Some others were completely silenced.
Do you think that that the kind of the COVID crisis and all it is doing to silence the arts has overwhelmed all the other subjects? So is it the case now that the kind of the fractures in society, the fact that some voices are louder than others, that's less important? Do you think it has unified the issues, or they haven't gone away? Presumably, the fact that some artists are silenced.
No, of course, they haven't gone away, and that's what I was trying to say earlier. I think it didn't go away at all. I think I think that it, on a certain extent, there's a new voice that's coming now that is more democratic to all these artists. Whether they're asked to be silenced, they would not be silenced anymore. And I think themselves, they would not silence themselves. I mean, both silences, and whether it's a self-censorship or an outside political decision to silence the culture, and the reaction is growing. And I'd like to remember an old sentence, which is not from me, but I love it. Guthrie, the folk singer, the American folk singer, who said with his guitar, saying that this is an anti-fascist machine. These words should, they linger on, at least in my soul. And I think music is an anti-fascist machine. I think that culture is one. And I think that our societies today, in certain measures, have been, have certain similarities with what was going on back then. We're talking about the fascist era, but not as clear and not as open and not at all the same story. But it takes different faces when it comes to being a fascist. You can be fascist with a big smile, so you cannot just keep people and musicians and artists and culture out of the balance. They have a very clear role in the society, and whether they are completely into politics and socially implicated, or whether they're only expressing themselves, their role is to keep the light on.
It's been quite a trip through the world of silence over the last few weeks. I've met artists who've been silenced and have broken silences across Europe. I pay tribute to them all, to their extraordinary and ongoing work, often being a voice in the quiet, working to keep the light on. My thanks on this episode to Erdem, Manick, Mayssa and Jackie, and my wish for us all is that we should use silence, but not be silent. Ashka's Danser Encore, which Mayssa mentioned, has become a Lunkdown anthem. YouTube is full of flash mob versions from across France. He very kindly gave us permission to use his song to close out our podcast series. We're taking our own short break of silence for a few weeks as we prepare for our next series. You can catch all the episodes from this series and any of our previous episodes on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the Dash Arts podcast, please do share loudly and leave us a review. It helps us stay visible and would mean the world to us. The Dash Arts podcast was produced by Rachel Head. I'm Josephine Burton, and we'll be back soon with more conversations. Thank you for listening.
On veut continuer à danser encore, voir nos pensées enlacer nos corps, passer nos vies sur une grille d'accord. Oh non, 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 on veut continuer à danser encore, voir nos pensées enlacer nos corps, passer nos vies sur une grille d'accord. Nous sommes des oiseaux de passage, jamais dociles ni vraiment sages, nous ne faisons pas allégeance à l'aube en toutes circonstances. Nous venons briser le silence. Et quand le soir à la télé, Monsieur le bon roi parlait, venu annoncer la sentence, nous faisons preuve d'irrévérence, mais toujours avec élégance. Oh, attestation, consigne, absurdité sur ordonnance. Et malheur à celui qui pense, et malheur à celui qui danse. Chaque mesure autoritaire, chaque relance sécuritaire voit s'envoler notre confiance. Ils font preuve de tant d'insistance pour confiner notre conscience. Oh non, 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 on veut continuer à danser encore, voir nos pensées enlacer nos corps, passer nos vies sur une grille, d'accord. Oh non, 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 on veut continuer à danser encore, voir nos pensées enlacer nos corps, passer nos vies sur une grille, d'accord. Impressionnable par tous ces gens déraisonnables, vendeurs de peur en abondance. Sachons les tenir à distance, angoissant jusqu'à l'indécence. Pour notre santé mentale, sociale et environnementale, nos sourires, notre intelligence. Ne soyons pas sans résistance, les instruments de leur démence. Oh non, 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 non. Passer nos vies sur une grille, d'accord. Oh non, 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 nous, on veut continuer à danser encore, voir nos pensées enlacer nos corps, passer nos vies sur une grille, d'accord.